Greetings, comrades. You're listening to The Truth Tank, and I'm your host, The Tank. This is a very special episode of The Truth Tank. This is Chapter 2 of The Lie of Communism, the long-awaited sequel to Chapter 1. If you haven't listened to Chapter 1 by now, I recommend you hit pause and go ahead and listen to that right now, because Chapter 2 isn't going to make a hell of a lot of sense. Chapter 2 will pick up right where Chapter 1 left off, after the events of the Bloody Sunday Massacre. Chapter 2 is another jam-packed installment of The Lie of Communism, so let's waste no more time. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. This is The Lie of Communism, Chapter 2, Aftermath of the Bloody Sunday Massacre, Lenin's War Against the Tsar, World War I and the Great Proletariat Revolution. Just before we get into Chapter 2, we're going to have a quick rundown of the events in Chapter 1. Where we last left off, Russia was in a very traumatic and transitional time. The Bloody Sunday Massacre was the one event that pushed a lot of support over to Lenin, and it pretty much sealed Tsar Nicholas's fate. He wasn't very sympathetic to his people. He had multiple opportunities to make things right. He could have prevented the massacre from happening in the first place. Then after the events of the Bloody Sunday Massacre, he more or less doubles down, issues a very generic apology to his people, which ultimately seals his fate and pushes a huge amount of support Lenin's way. And this is the opportunity that Lenin really was waiting for. Lenin's career was taking off. He wasn't quite the historical figure that we know him to be at this time. The Bolshevik Party was growing in popularity, but it was still kind of a fringe group at this point. There were a lot of people that were very wary of this new political movement, the Bolsheviks, and the rival group, the Mensheviks. Despite all of Tsar Nicholas's failings, he still had supporters. There were still Tsar loyalists that would support the Tsar until the end of time, but his popularity was waning. A lot of neutral supporters of the Tsar were pushed Lenin and the Bolsheviks' way. Public opinion is definitely swayed in the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks' favour. I don't see how public opinion couldn't be directed Lenin's way. You can imagine if Albo did that here, or Trump, or whatever world leader, there would be national outrage instantaneously. You can imagine if a world leader decided to call the army or the police in on a peaceful protest and killed half the participants there. They wouldn't be a very popular leader for very long, and it would probably spark revolution. Even if you had a stable society, one not on the edge of revolution as Russia was at this time. If this happened in Australia, politics is pretty boring here. We don't really have too many wacko, interesting leaders. They're pretty vanilla for the most part. I could just imagine the reaction if something like that happened in a modern setting. People wouldn't stand for it. Even 100 years ago, people wouldn't stand for it. The Bloody Sunday Massacre, in my opinion, is one of the key events that pushes all this support to the Bolsheviks and Lenin's way and helps kickstart the revolution. But there are multiple revolutions that happen over the next couple of years. So revolution is a bit of a term that is used loosely because several revolutions happened over a pretty close span of time. Over the next couple of years, it's one revolution after the other. After the Bloody Sunday Massacre, the people were ready for revolution. Lenin had got his wish, and the Tsar's fate was sealed. The Tsar could no longer bullshit his way out of this situation. He couldn't talk his way out of it. He couldn't write a public memo apologising for what he had done. He went too far. He was too heavy-handed, and ultimately history judges him very harshly for this event. Even though I don't think he was the worst leader in history, he wasn't the best, he wasn't the worst. He was kind of in the middle. Yeah, I've never met the guy, but from all historical reports, he doesn't seem to be that switched on. He seems to be very easily led, not really a man of the people. He seems to me like a man living in a very isolated bubble. He's in this insulated world. He lives in palaces, he's surrounded by servants, he has nice food, and he doesn't have to suffer like 95% of his subjects do. He was born into wealth and royalty. He's obviously a member of the Russian royal family, so that should probably come as no surprise, but he doesn't really seem to get his hands dirty like you see a lot of modern royals doing, because you can't get away with this type of stuff in the modern day. There's too many cameras, public opinion has changed. Royal families are more or less ceremonial. They don't really have a lot to do with running countries anymore. Their words and their laws aren't taken as seriously as they used to. Going back to Queen Elizabeth, the Prime Minister of England and Parliament made all the governmental decisions. I think she could overrule some of them. She could make recommendations, but she didn't really have anything to do with the day-to-day running of Parliament. Not like Queen Victoria did or King Henry, where whatever the king or queen wanted or said or decreed, put into writing or made a law, went. And Tsar Nicholas comes along at this weird transitional time where I get the impression he is of the mind where he thinks whatever he says and does is just going to be accepted by the people and no one's going to say anything about it. He can just ignore the plight of the people. People are starving, they're overworked, they have no money. It's a brutal existence. And then all of a sudden this upstart Lenin comes along promising this better utopian future. Join the Bolshevik Party and you can get justice and a better society. That's an attractive offer if you are a peasant factory worker in 1900s Russia. You're freezing to death, you get fuck all to eat, you don't have enough to feed your family, you can't save, you get probably a cheap house somewhere, subsidised maybe by the government, I'm not too sure. It's a pretty miserable existence. Whatever end of society you find yourself is pretty much the end you're going to stay on until you die. The factory workers were not quite slave masters, but they had all the money and wealth. They paid their workers fuck all. They overworked them. There was no safety or human resource division back then. If you got hurt on the job, that was about your bad luck. You either worked injured or you put up with it, or you could go starve and freeze, depending on the severity of the injury, I guess. Imagine there would have been a lot of deaths in factories at this time as well. To those factory workers who may or may not be Tsar loyalists, when you have a guy like Lenin come along preaching this better future, even if he's full of shit, you're going to believe him, because this happens in politics today. You pick the side that bullshits the least. If you have no dog in the fight, if you're not for Labour or Liberal or Democrat or Republican, you're going to vote for the least insane candidate, or the candidate that's going to give you the best deal, the best opportunity, or is promising the best course of action if they're elected. The Russian people are well and truly pissed off at Nick. The timing is right. Revolution is in the air. All Lenin really needs to do now is just stir the pot, sit back and wait, and let destiny unfold. It's 1905. The Russian Revolution kicks off. This is also known as the failed 1905 revolution. You would think that Lenin, being a man of the people and being so obsessed with revolution, would be partaking in the 1905 revolution, leading his people down the street to the glorious workers' utopia. But I know, Lenin is abroad. He's attending socialist meetings every year or so. He's more or less living it up in places like Paris and Switzerland, while his quote-unquote oppressed countrymen are massacred while doing the heavy lifting for a revolution. He's essentially sitting back just talking shit from a safe place where he can't be targeted by the Tsar. Lenin is definitely a puppet master around this time. He is pulling the strings behind the scenes. His comrades Trotsky and Chernov are doing all the groundwork while he is abroad, presumably in exile again. But unsurprisingly, the 1905 revolution fails. And this brings us to our current timeline. The Bolshevik Party over the past year had grown in popularity and strength. This is not much of a surprise, given this is the wake of the Bloody Sunday Massacre. The Russian people could see that change was on the horizon, and the Bolsheviks represented that change. It's no wonder that so many people come over to their side. Post Bloody Sunday Massacre, a lot of people were just so angry at the Tsar, they just joined the Bolshevik Party. Even those that didn't agree with Lenin or the Bolshevik Party and thought he was a bit of a radical chose to side with the Bolsheviks rather than the Tsar, the long-established ruling class of Imperial Russia. And as I mentioned before about people voting for the candidate that represents the less risk, the less riskier option, or the least insane candidate, this is exactly the same thing playing out here. People were flocking to Lenin and the Bolsheviks because it was better than the old ways. Pure and simple. The RSDLP Central Committee by the spring of 1905 was completely all Bolshevik, which is a pretty big event in its own right. When we last saw Lenin, him and Julius Martov were at odds with each other. Martov formed the Menshevik Party, the minority, and Lenin forms the Bolshevik Party, the majority. So this is only a few months after the Bloody Sunday Massacre, and the Central Committee was all Bolshevik, so they could more or less run unopposed or with very little opposition. The only opposition would have come from inside their own party. To celebrate this, the Bolsheviks released another paper called Perd with a silent V. It was released in December, just in time for Christmas. During the unrest, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks come into conflict with one another. Once again, this is pretty unsurprising given the rocky relationship last time we saw them. Lenin wanted the Bolsheviks to get more involved, and he did what he did best. He runs his mouth and starts to spook shit behind the scenes, more or less trying to orchestrate a conflict. And what Lenin does next shows just how irresponsible he can be. In my opinion, it also shows how void of any morality Lenin really is, how insane he can be, and just a complete and utter disregard for any responsibility whatsoever. From the shadows, Lenin encourages violent insurrection. He wants war and he wants violence, but he doesn't want to get his own hands dirty while doing it. He would rather talk shit, stir the pot, and let others do the fighting and groundwork for him. He starts using social revolutionary slogans such as the real cheery catchphrase of quote-unquote mass terror, armed insurrection, and my favourite catchphrase, the expropriation of gentry land. What are the opposition party, the Mensheviks, to do in rebuttal to these cheery slogans of mass violence and terror? The Mensheviks call out Lenin and start accusing him of going against orthodox Marxism, which in turn leads Lenin to suggest that the two parties separate. This unsurprisingly causes a rift between the two parties. A lot of Bolsheviks refused to split. Lenin couldn't have that, so in April of 1905, the third RSDLP Congress was held at the Brotherhood Church in London. During the Congress, Lenin delivered his spiel, rattling off communist ideals from his new pamphlet, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. You really have to love Lenin and just how fucking massive his balls really are. There's nothing really that democratic about Lenin's ideas. He was obsessed with this idea of conflict. He doesn't want to do any of the fighting himself or really get his hands dirty, but he just wants to start conflict after conflict, then fuck off overseas when violence does erupt. I really do think Lenin is an instigator. I think he kind of really gets off on that stirring the pot, instigating a fight, then fucking off to a different country, quote unquote supposedly in exile, and letting others do the dirty work for him. Could you call him a psychopath? Probably. I'm not a psychiatrist of any kind. In my opinion, I think he definitely has some sociopathic and psychopathic tendencies. He's kind of like the third sibling. He stirs the pot, starts trouble, gets the older two brothers or sisters in trouble, and blames it on them, plays innocent, fucks off. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but he does have this obsession with war and conflict, and it's just not just one like revolution that wipes the slate clean, allowing him to build this socialist utopia. He wants this ongoing proletariat war on a continental scale. And the Mensheviks, I think, are in the right in this. They should have called him out. They should have called out the complete bullshit of Lenin. And in a way, this is all retrospectively speaking, it's a bit of a preview of what was to come and the lengths Lenin would go to regain control. So the pamphlet is written in June and July of 1905 and published the following month in August. The other reoccurring theme with Lenin is he loves to have a congress or a conference. And from doing the research, it appears that every time he doesn't get his own way, he calls a conference, his ideas are shot down, and he heads to London or Switzerland to quote-unquote recover or recuperate. Because the stress leaves him so ill. I also think Lenin has a very dark cloud following him around. He seems to attract negative energy wherever he goes. And he doesn't really seem to understand that not everyone is going to get on board with his very radical ideas at the time. And these are radical ideas in 1905, and they're radical ideas in 2025. So you can understand the opposition from the Mensheviks and even members of his own party. These ideas were very radical, and they're ideas that you really only get one chance of pulling off. And to a point, we can understand why Lenin is the way he is. He's lost one brother to the Tsar. His brother Sasha was executed under the Tsarist government. Fair enough, he was making a bomb to use against the Tsarist government, which leads to his execution. Lenin takes this out on the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas is the recipient of all of Lenin's hate and anger and all the injustice he saw going on around him. On one hand, Lenin definitely needs to be called out for his extremism. And was this just him being a showman, trying to appear more passionate? Do you generally believe in a war and a conflict that would cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people for this socialist dream of his? Did he generally believe that, or was he just so hyped up in the moment during his congresses and in his pamphlets that he does kind of lose sight of the reality of a continent-wide war? And that's where it's very hard to draw the line with Lenin. Is he insane? Does he generally believe this stuff, or is he just hyped up in the moment? And this is a period of time where a lot of stuff is happening very quick. The Bloody Sunday Massacre was only a few months ago. This is June, July of 1905. It's only a few months down the track. Things seem to be evolving in Russian society very quickly at this time. Now, is he just a man of the times? Is he a man for the times? Or is he just caught up in the times? And it's these factors that can make trying to analyze and decode Lenin's character and his motivations very difficult. While at the Congress, Lenin predicts the future, that Russia's bourgeoisie would be happy with constitutional monarchy and would reject the quote-unquote revolution, and that working classes and the peasants would have to team up in order to overthrow the Tsar and his government, all in the attempt to establish the quote-unquote provincial, revolutionary, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Fuck, some of these titles are long. They could have shortened that to the provincial, revolutionary dictatorship of the peasantry. Lenin and the communists do love a drawn-out title. Can't say I blame them, I do as well. I think all my podcasts have multiple titles in them. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, if you need any more proof that this guy was a complete fucking psycho, this is a quote by Lenin regarding the 1905 revolution. The uprising has begun. Force against force, street fighting is raging. Barricades are being thrown up, rifles are cracking, guns are booming, rivers of blood are flowing. The civil war for freedom is blazing up. Moscow and the South, the Caucasus and Poland are ready to join the proletariat of St. Petersburg. The slogan of the workers has become death or freedom. And that last statement, I think, is a very key point. Death or freedom. Sound familiar? There was a similar slogan in the American Revolutionary War, death or liberty or death. I think it was give me liberty or give me death. So Lenin is definitely tapping into these universal themes. Freedom or death. It's better to die than not to be free. But is this an honest desire for the future of Russia? Was this Lenin's plan all along? Does he actually want freedom for the people? Or is it a big con or even a trick? Because we do know how the story ends after all. Russia still struggles with a lot of these themes today. Was it a giant ruse by Lenin just to get more control? Did he actually believe in this? The uprising has begun, force against force. Lenin's quote regarding the 1905 revolution. When you look back at Lenin's quote regarding the 1905 revolution, it is pretty disturbing. There's a lot of inflammatory language. If this type of speech or quote came out from a modern day politician, the alarm bells would be fucking ringing. And yeah, is he just trying to gain more public opinion and more support to his own cause? Is he trying to appear like he's a man for the people? It definitely sounds like it to me. He's more or less trying to glorify the 1905 revolution, inserting himself as this champion of the people and saying they've got support from Moscow to the South Caucasus and in Poland. The slogan of the workers has become death or freedom. Well, who gave them that slogan? Was that Lenin? I seriously doubt the workers gave themselves that slogan. So where did it come from? And in my opinion, it definitely sounds like Lenin is trying to use this as a very good piece of PR and marketing. He's really trying hard to drum up support for his revolution, or the revolution he's more or less going to piggyback on and pretend that it's his own. The Congress continues for the next couple of months. Lenin and most of the people involved in the Congress were all in exile again. Not that surprising because Tsar Nicholas was still in power. In the wake of the Bloody Sunday Massacre, not a lot had changed. Russian society continued as it always had. Tsar Nicholas and the royal family were still in control. Speaking of Tsar Nicholas, a few things did change over the past several months. The Tsar and his government had to accept a series of liberal reforms called the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto came as a direct result of the Bloody Sunday Massacre. Once again, it's not really that surprising. Some action was needed because these people were not happy with him and the direction him and his government decided to go in. I'll also make an educated guess and say these reforms most likely would have had something to do with or were directly influenced by Father Capon's petition. The October Manifesto was officially referred to as the Manifesto on the Improvement of the State Order. And I think this is pretty obvious. You don't have to be Nostradamus to work out that something needed to change. After the Bloody Sunday Massacre, the Tsar could not ignore his people forever. Nick could no longer pretend that all was right with society and that his people were happy. He had to face the elephant in the room. The October Manifesto, as the title suggests, was the improvement of the current social standings. The manifesto was a precursor to the first constitution of the Russian Empire, which came into effect the following year in 1906. The Tsar issued the manifesto under the guidance of Sergei Witte, who served as Russia's first prime minister after Nick fucked off. Now, Sergei Witte seems like a pretty decent dude. He wasn't a liberal or a communist. He wanted to open Russia up to foreign investment and avoid the upcoming war. The upcoming war he was referring to was World War I. Sergei's focus was on expanding Russia's industrialization. Not sure Lenin would have got along with Mr. Witte. He doesn't want war and he's a capitalist. Two things that seem to be directly opposed to what Lenin wants. But Sergei does have a point. Russia did need to open itself up to foreign investment. This was a crucial step at avoiding the war and making it a more prosperous place for the people and the workers. Foreign investment would have been good, more factories would have opened, more business opportunities would have arisen, and I dare say the workers and peasants probably would have earned a better wage. But all was not rosy. Tsar Nicholas had a problem with the manifesto. Things can't just go along smoothly after all. Someone has to have a problem with something. Tsar Nicholas protested the changes until Grand Duke Nicholas, who was the Tsar's number one choice to lead a military dictatorship, threatened to shoot himself in the head if he didn't accept Witty's proposal. It's also a pretty drastic way to get somebody to see the error of their ways. And Duke Nicholas was the commander-in-chief of the army during the war. So this dramatic turn of events forces Nick to accept the manifesto, which outlined a basic level of civil rights. An elected parliament, also known as a Duma, which outlined no laws would be enacted in Russia in the future without going through the parliament. And to be clear, nobody made Tsar Nick sign the manifesto. So what happened? Lenin gets what he wants, right? Isn't this more or less what Lenin and the Bolsheviks had been fighting for all these years? More civil rights, an elected parliament to oversee decisions and laws for the Russian people. Isn't this what the Bolsheviks always wanted? Lenin could have worked with the manifesto. All these problems would have been solved and there would have been a social change. Whether it would have lasted or not is a completely different story. If the Tsar had remained in power, I think he probably would have eventually overridden the manifesto, or he would have changed certain things favouring himself, either to give himself probably more power or to lessen the impact of the parliament. It's a hard one to predict, really, because Tsar Nick seems to be struggling with a constitutionally elected government. He definitely seems like he is well and truly of the old school, where it's the royal family making the decisions for society. He doesn't seem to want to let go of the reins of power just yet. He definitely still wants to remain in control and not have to go through an elected parliament, because that means a lot of his ideas probably wouldn't go through, and he would probably have to either pay workers more, enact more civil rights that might not benefit his own pockets or his own government. That's all hypothetical, of course. It also appears on the surface that both opposing sides, the Tsar and the Bolsheviks, could have found a middle ground with this manifesto. There could have been some negotiation, there could have been a getting on the same page, if you will. There could have been some diplomacy between both sides, and Lenin could have taken the higher ground and said that he would like to talk about this manifesto to work things out. They'll stop the protests and the revolutionary rhetoric. That way he would have appeared to the people to be putting their best interests at heart and really trying to make a go of settling old scores with the Tsar. But obviously this doesn't happen. The Constitution of 1906 was a major overhaul of the 1832 fundamental laws of the Russian Empire. It's been a very long time without a change in laws, so no wonder why Lenin and the working classes were so pissed off. Nothing had changed in decades, and if we look at modern day politics and law changes, laws change very quickly now these days. I know just in Australia, some of the older laws went on for, it seemed like 50, 60, 70 years, some of them, before they finally got changed in the modern day. You look at these social media bans and overhauls to cyber laws. The government's had 20 years to see that type of stuff coming, and it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that anything has really happened. The internet's been around for a while, so has social media, yet the government was pretty slow at changing. So you can understand Lenin and the working classes being so pissed off. 1832 to 1906 is a fair chunk of time. It's an even longer period of time when you think nothing really changed at all to benefit the workers. The same working conditions, same wages, same living conditions. It appears as if Russia at the time was a society stuck in a bit of a time warp. It was very much stuck in the early to mid 1800s, and at the time of the Constitution, this was the early 1900s. Industrialization was a thing. Obviously, industrialization started in the 1800s, but not everywhere in the world was as caught up and as modern as places like the United Kingdom or the US. The Constitution changed the old ways of absolute monarchy, where whatever the Tsar said went, into one where he had to share his power with the parliament. Without the vote of parliament, nothing could be enacted into law. So no more Nick getting his own ways, no more ignoring the people, fucking off to your holiday house, and letting your troops massacre a bunch of peaceful protesters. This is a pretty major change. Lenin should be rejoicing in the streets, but oh no, that's definitely not the Lenin way. The Constitution came into effect on the 6th of May 1906. But looking at the Constitution from a different angle, it could be seen as one last grand gesture of the imperial government from basically being resigned to the pages of a history book and being forgotten. The Duma was made up of half elected officials and half appointed by the Tsar himself. The Tsar appointed half of the members of the upper house. The other half were elected from clergy, those in commercial and industrial sectors, and various governments. The lower house was a different story. Members were selected by the Russian people, including upper, middle, and working classes / peasants. Members were chosen via an overly complex system of indirect elections that favoured more or less a rigged system. So in a way, it made sure that most of the members were made up of property-owning classes. So even this apparently new fair system was in some way manipulated more or less to a certain side. And just when you think things are getting fairer, and I suppose in some regards they are, but in others, the parliament more or less favours the Tsar's interests. He's choosing half of the appointed officials, and the other half have to come from a certain demographic of society, which is pretty much not the poor, downtrodden workers that they are claiming to represent, because even the working classes and peasants have to be elected via this very complex electoral system, and they have to be members of the property-owning classes. And during Russia at the time, land-owning peasantry was a big thing. These were more or less farmers who owned agricultural producing farms, essentially. They weren't like the farmers we think of today. They weren't making a lot of money, but they had enough to own the farms that they worked, which a lot of their produce would go back to the government anyway. It's a very complex and weird system, and if you're in the Western world, it's a completely alien idea, because farmers here in Australia, not all of them, this is generally speaking, seem to be pretty well off. They own their farms, some of them generate millions of dollars in revenue. Yes, they do it tough, and they are doing it tough now with droughts and food shortages. There are a lot of farmers who are making quite a lot of money. So it's a completely different concept from farmers in the Western world or landowners. If you're a business or landowner in the Western world, you're doing all right, I'd say. But in Russia at the time, it's a completely different story. It shouldn't really come as much of a surprise that this system favoured the Tsar and his interests. The Tsar wasn't the type of man that was going to put his own power in jeopardy. Any law or reform passed by Tsar Nicholas benefited Tsar Nicholas. And given his reluctance to even adopt changes put forth by the people after Bloody Sunday Massacre, it shouldn't really be that surprising that this new system favours him quite heavily. It also seems like something that he would do. But having said that, I also imagine there was probably some limits placed on him by the opposing half of the elected officials. I couldn't imagine he could just get his way that easily this time. But having said that, there was a very large catch-22. Nick, being a prick, wouldn't stand for anything less than absolute control over the parliament. The Duma had the power of legislation and could question any of the ministers that had been appointed by the Tsar. But here's the catch. It could not appoint or dismiss any minister. Only Tsar Nicholas could do that. Same went for the Constitution. It couldn't be altered by Parliament, only by Nick himself. He also reserved the right to veto legislation, issue decrees in times when the Duma was absent. There was a 2-month validity clause in that. If no decision was made in a 2-month time frame, the Tsar's proposal lost the right to be accepted. And he could also dismiss the Duma whenever he liked for any reason that suited him. In other words, it was 110 fucking million% rigged. He still wants absolute control over everything that happens in Russia. And looking at that from a modern perspective, is this not that dissimilar to what Putin has done? He's changed laws so he can basically rule for life. It seems like as much as Putin has criticised Tsar Nicholas, he has taken more than a few leaves from his playbook. Because Putin pretty much rules Russia as a dictatorship. It's supposed to be a federation. It's supposed to have I'm not an expert in Russian politics, but I'm pretty sure it has an elected parliament, the same way Russia did back then under Tsar Nicholas. But he seems to make pretty much every decision unopposed. He's more of a modern gangster version of Tsar Nicholas, but it's still pretty similar. So if that isn't 110 million% rigged, I don't know what is. He's accepted this new parliamentary proposition only to more or less have complete control over everything that is said or done in it. How can anything meaningfully change if this is the only option the people have? How can anything really change under this new system when it's basically the same as the old system? Nothing is learnt by Tsar Nicholas after the Bloody Sunday Massacre. No responsibility or regret has been shown of any kind. The only thing that's really affected Tsar Nicholas is the minor inconvenience to his time, having to go through all this bullshit to agree to this new form of parliament. When we look back at Tsar Nicholas in a retrospective historical lens, he is seen as a victim. And if you do know your history, you know what befalls Tsar Nicholas. But at this time, he does seem like a bit of a prick. He's completely isolated himself from his own people. He doesn't want to know anything that has happened. He doesn't care about their plight, and he doesn't really seem to want to do anything to fix their current situation, even though he can. The same way he didn't give a fuck if thousands of people died because he chose to ignore Father Gapon's petition. He could have changed all of that, and Tsar Nicholas at this time comes off more like a dictator than a leader concerned with the plight of his own people. He seems like a controlling and very narcissistic individual. Because if he genuinely gave a shit about his people, why wouldn't he have changed? Why wouldn't he have changed the parliament to at least appear to show the people some compassion and that some of their concerns were being addressed in this quote-unquote new form of parliament? It's also not hard to see Lenin's point of view either. Lenin, at this point, still looks like the hero. He's the hero fighting the big bad Tsar and championing the plight of the people. He's basically become the warrior for the downtrodden peasants and workers of society. Even though he's technically not on the front lines himself, he's still in exile. He has inserted himself as the hero of their story, the one that will basically bring this huge prophesized change to Russia and fundamentally change history. He is going to do that. He is the people's champion, or at least that's how he wants to be perceived. And he is doing a very good PR and marketing campaign to back that up. It's also not hard to get on board with Lenin at this time. Nick does not seem to get it. He doesn't seem to give two fucks about his people. If you put yourself in their shoes, if you were an oppressed worker or part of the peasantry class, you are going to join Lenin. Even if you didn't like the guy, he appears to have your best interests at heart. If I was an oppressed worker or peasant back then, I'd be getting on board with Lenin 110%. I'd be joining the Bolsheviks as fast as I could. Even if I didn't necessarily like Lenin or the Bolsheviks, it's better than the alternative. The alternative is a out-of-touch, aristocratic member of the royal family who thinks he has complete dominion over everything that happens in the land. My needs and my concerns aren't being addressed. The people are being more restricted. They're being pissed on by the Tsar. This guy called Lenin rolls through town preaching this crusade against the Tsar, making himself out that he's the champion of the people, promising to bring this new, fair, utopian society where everybody's equal and everyone can get a share of the pie. That sounds like a pretty good deal given the alternative. Why wouldn't I want to join Lenin? He seems to have my best interests at heart. Lenin comes crashing through the streets, crusading this campaign against Tsar Nicholas, the big bad guy in the eyes of the people. Why wouldn't I want to join? Yeah, this guy might have a bit of a god complex, but at the moment, he represents my interests. The Tsar doesn't. Why wouldn't I want to join him? But unsurprisingly, Tsar Nicholas had a problem and was very upset. In his eyes, he was forced to enact the charter and ultimately be vilified as a result of it. During his coronation, he'd sworn to pass on leadership to his son, and that doesn't look like that's going to happen if this new form of parliament takes shape. His son would be in a similar position that he would be. So what does good old Nick do? He dismisses the first and second Dumas. According to him, they were, quote, unsatisfactory. What he does next is a step too far, even for him. He unilaterally alters election statutes, violating the constitution in the process. Alterations made stated more landowners were to be elected in future Dumas. And this is a bit of a what the fuck moment. In other words, Nick is completely stacking the cabinet in his favour. And this is a further example of him wanting complete control of the parliament. Otherwise, why would you do it? It's the same shit that happens today when a candidate gets elected, where they promise a bunch of cushy Senate or Congress positions for their friends who voted for them. They get them the job, and in return, they vote how they want to. So how did Lenin and the Bolshevik Party react? They wanted restrictions placed on landowners. The third and fourth Dumas were more successful, although there was a lot of fighting between the Tsar's cronies in parliament due to the direction of state policy and the Russian state. This did come back to bite Nick in 1917, however, when the revolution breaks out. The Duma had a lot to do with the abdication and the destruction of the monarchy, the provincial government taking over, and the rise of communism and dictatorship in the coming years. Before I started doing the research for this chapter, I always thought that Tsar Nicholas was misunderstood, and he unfairly becomes the object of the people's anger. But I can kind of see why he is so hated by everybody now. He's an absolute control freak. He has no regard for the people or the state, just his own power. In the year following the Bloody Sunday Massacre, he doesn't do a lot to try to resolve the people's issues with him and his government. It appears to me that Tsar Nicholas views his people as a threat. Otherwise, why would he act like this? Why would he want even more control if he didn't have anything to fear? Control is usually an action or reaction of fear. The fear of losing something, the fear of giving something up. It's usually an extension of that. And to me, it does actually seem like Nick is generally scared of his own people. Why is the question that really needs to be asked. But it does seem like he is terrified of his own people, or simply doesn't care and is a complete egomaniac. Either way, he's a very interesting character because he has so many opportunities to rectify his past mistakes, but he just doubles down like, I hate to say it, modern day politicians do. There's no regard for the plight of the people or their suffering. It's just his own power. And unfortunately, if you walk on people long enough, they will eventually walk on you. As things come to pass later on in this tale, Tsar Nicholas gets hit by a very large karma bus. It's during this time Lenin feels that it is safe enough to make his glorious and triumphant return to St. Petersburg. Lenin used his legal newspaper, Novoye Shin, meaning New Life, edited by actress and Bolshevik administrator Maria Andreeva and Maria Fydorovna Yakovska. Lenin used his newly launched newspaper, New Life, to keep the people informed and to spew more hate. He talked about the RSDLP's issues and used it as a recruitment platform for potential members. Kind of smart when you think about it. He's telling his version of the truth via this paper. He's putting his narrative out there and he's trying to recruit potential members to join his cause. He also used the paper to call for endless violence, which may or may not have been necessary for the revolution. Using the paper as a recruitment tool and a way to get his narrative and his version of the truth out there also was a stroke of genius. The more people recruited meant more members, membership fees and donations for the cause. In a way, the paper was a means to an end and a way for the Bolsheviks to fund the party. So much for the downfall of capitalism. After all, you pretty much need money to do anything. Bolsheviks aren't exempt from this. They needed a certain amount of capital to keep producing newspapers. Paper and ink aren't free. Neither are the factories where the equipment for printing papers are held. You need distribution. You need to pay people to deliver papers, to write them. Editors need to be paid, so do the workers. Even though the Bolsheviks were down with capitalism, they still needed a large amount of capital to get their operation off the ground, which in a sense is hypocritical. They also needed money to travel, to go into exile, to live it up in Paris and Switzerland every 3 months, or whenever they weren't welcome back in the motherland. Lenin was a very smart man. He knew all too well you couldn't run a party or a newspaper from the money donated by 2 or 3 rich donors. A more sustainable revenue source was needed, hence the paper. Looking at this newspaper, if you were a disgruntled, downtrodden, oppressed worker, and this new publication comes out, preaching revolution, down with the monarchy and all that, social change and being part of history, you can't tell me you wouldn't be interested in this new and exciting Bolshevik movement. Lenin knew all too well that newspapers and donors weren't going to keep the Bolshevik train on the tracks forever. He needed newer and bigger revenue streams, and supported the idea of raising funds that were, how do I say it, less than orthodox and illegal. Some of these new revenue ideas included robbing train stations, post offices, and banks. This goes far beyond just supporting the Bolshevik cause. This leads to a small group of Bolsheviks forming a crime ring, who start to carry out criminal activities led by a man named Leonid Borisovich Krasin. Krasin was an engineer, social entrepreneur, Soviet politician and diplomat, and Bolshevik revolutionary politician. Quite the title. He was also one of Lenin's original followers, and get this, he was the first finance wizard of the Communist Party. Imagine that, a financial wizard in the Communist Party. That seems like oil and water, if you ask me. But I guess like everything, money makes the world go round, even Bolshevik parties that want to bring about the downfall of capitalism. Which is ironic because you need capital to fund a party against capitalism, in a way. One of these armed robberies took place in Georgia in June of 1907, involving everyone's favourite Soviet strongman, the man, the myth, the monster, Joseph Stalin. The target to be robbed was the state bank. If you don't know who Joseph Stalin is, you have obviously been living under a rock for the past 60 years, or are completely void of any historical knowledge whatsoever. I won't be going into a full bio on Joseph Stalin because he could warrant his own 50-part podcast. If you've been sleeping under a rock for the last 60 years and know nothing about history, here is a brief rundown of Joseph Stalin. Most people should know Stalin by now. He is one of history's worst psychopaths. He has one of the highest body counts of any dictator in all history. Hitler gets a lot of credit for being one of history's number one bad guys. In my opinion, I think Stalin was much worse. He ruled for twice as long, killed 3 times as many people, and was just as brutal. We'll come back to the legacy of Stalin a little later. Back to the bank robbery. On June the 26th, a group of Bolsheviks led by Joseph Stalin expropriated a shipment of money on its way to the Tiflis branch of the State Bank of the Russian Empire by stagecoach. The goal was to rob the stagecoach en route to the bank in order to further fund revolutionary activities. Little did I know when I was researching this that this was how the Bolshevik Party funded their operations, through robberies, extortions, and scams. They were pretty much outlaws, similar to the Wild West. I guess in a way they were Eastern European versions of cowboys without being involved with livestock in any way. I guess the biggest difference is the Wild West outlaws were in it for themselves, where the Bolsheviks want to overthrow the government for their own gain. So I guess both of them are in it for themselves. The Bolsheviks just have more ambitious goals for this money, I guess. The stagecoach made its way through the city, through the Erenvinsky Square. When the coach was in between the post office and the bank, the Bolsheviks attacked the coach with bombs and guns, surrounding it and its crew of police and soldiers. Around 40 people were killed during the attack/robbery, and about another 50 were wounded. Official reports state the robbers got away with around $241,000. In today's money, that would put that figure at $2,941.41 US. Hardly worth the effort or the death toll for an amount that low, or any amount for that matter. It's not a lot of money when you think about it, but I guess back then it probably was, and it probably would have gone a fair way. While the robbery was organised by the Bolsheviks' top brass, Lenin and Stalin, etc., it had not been sanctioned by Bolshevik leadership. The robbery and its aftermath, especially the death toll it caused, creates a rift within the party. Robbery and other illegal activities were forbidden by the Fifth Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the RSLDP, which forces Stalin and Lenin to go into damage control. These two being the culprits who authorised the robbery in the first place, one of which participated in carrying it out. Not a good look for the leader of the party. It also really does bring into question Lenin's character. He is sanctioning robberies to fund the party. So much for a champion of the people. I guess they're attacking a certain end of society, but that just shows this psychopathic intent. He's willing to kill people who have more than him in order to fund a party so he can take majority control, start this prophesized revolution and free the oppressed people. It seems completely insane, and it was a completely insane situation. Or is it just a case of desperate times lead to desperate measures? I guess at the time, no one really predicted that Joseph Stalin was going to turn out to be the monster he ends up becoming. And it's also a very obvious contentious issue within Bolshevik leadership. And I imagine a fair few of them would have been dead set against robbery and any illegal means of funding the party, because in a sense that delegitimizes the core ambition of the party itself. If you're going to do something illegal to fund it, then you're no better than the Tsar. The big difference being the Tsar has the power to kind of legalize and justify his actions, like sending the cavalry into a group of peaceful protesters or opening fire on protesters down the street. It's a very weird situation for the Bolshevik Party to find themselves in. Other members of the RSLDP were outraged by the robbery and murder of police, soldiers and civilians, and rightfully fucking so. Because aren't the police, soldiers and civilians the same people that Lenin is trying to champion, or pretend to? And as I just mentioned, not all of them would have been the same social standing as Lenin or the oppressed peasantry, but they're all still civilians. Attacking or robbing anything with explosives or firearms today would instantly get you labelled a terrorist. And at this time, the Bolsheviks were a faction within the RSLDP, which wasn't good news for the Bolshevik Party as a whole. As a result of the robberies, the leadership of the Bolshevik Party was split, and leaders went at each other. Lenin was forced to turn on other leaders who had agreed with him on the robbery. This would have been a very weird situation to find yourself in. The party is tearing itself apart from the inside all over this contentious issue of robbery and illegal fundraising. The robbery was also so destructive and divisive to the Bolshevik Party, it was not worth the $2,500 it raised. And ultimately, it was a complete and utter failure. The Bolsheviks couldn't even use the larger notes gained during the robbery to fund the cause, because the police had the serial numbers of the larger notes that had been stolen on record, much the same way banks do today. It was a lot of death and destruction for absolutely nothing. It just made the Bolsheviks bigger targets. It tore the party apart from the inside. It also would have created new enemies for the Bolshevik Party, turned old and new supporters away from them, and started to question the leadership, especially Lenin. If he was the one authorizing robberies, that doesn't show a lot of foresight, morality, or just good decision making of any kind from the leader of the party. But you can't keep Lenin down for very long, and he eventually comes up with a plan to wash the dirty money. In 1908, he has various people travel throughout Europe, cashing the recorded notes at different stores. This might have been a good idea in theory, kind of like communism, but this too fails. The police were onto them. Many of the people who were cashing the money were arrested, trying to cash in their dirty notes, resulting in more bad press for the party and a lot of negative feelings throughout the social democratic groups within Europe. And as I mentioned before, if Lenin and the Bolsheviks tried this today, they would be labelled as a terrorist group or an organised crime syndicate and be put on a watch list somewhere. In my own opinion, I think Lenin's lust for violence and the destruction of government and society place him in the terrorist or anarchist category. I don't think you can really see his actions or the actions of Stalin in any other light. If he was concerned with human life, he wouldn't have authorised the robberies in the first place. And whether the plan was to attack the stagecoach with bombs and guns or just guns remains to be seen. And ultimately it turns into a bloodbath where a lot of innocent people lose their lives because of Bolshevik arrogance. I may do an episode on the robbery in the future because it was pretty lengthy. There's a lot of detail to it and a lot of series of events leading up to it and afterwards. The robbery would be an entire episode within itself. Lenin's love of violence brings him into conflict once again with the Mensheviks, which comes to a head at the 4th RSLD Congress in Stockholm in April of 1906. Lenin had toyed with the idea of recognising the differences within the Bolshevik and Menshevik parties. But ultimately what prevents this was Lenin's first response to all of his problems, and that was the casual use of violence to get his own way. And in my opinion, I think the man is a fucking psychopath, or completely delusional on an absolutely epic scale. The delusions of grandeur with this guy are off the fucking charts. Up until now, Lenin's leadership had been pretty unstable and unpredictable. You would think that after all that had happened with Lenin and all these failed plots, the Bolshevik Party would want to get rid of Lenin for the survival of the party itself, if nothing else. But that's not how it turns out. After the 4th Congress and before the 5th Congress, Lenin helps to set up a Bolshevik center in Finland. He is most likely setting up another place that he can run off to when things go sideways, which they often did when Lenin was involved. In May the following year, 1907, the 5th Congress was held in London. So back in the motherland, Tsar Nicholas was bringing down the hammer on his opponents. Nick disbands the Second Duma, Russia's legislative assembly, also known as the Imperial Duma, which was the lower house of the governing Senate in the Russian Empire. The upper house was called the State Council. He also has his secret police known as the Okhrana, the department for protecting the public security, or in my opinion, oppressing it. The Okhrana were tasked with cracking down and arresting revolutionaries, which placed Lenin right in their crosshairs. After the robbery, Lenin's true intention, everything he ever said or did directed at the Tsar, would have become plainly obvious for the Tsar and his government to see. But it also shows that Tsar Nicholas hadn't changed either. Rather than try to build bridges, he decides to burn them. He has learned nothing after the events of the Bloody Sunday Massacre. He broke his promise to change things. He dismisses the Duma, goes back to basically being a typical tyrant that is terrified of change and any movement or individual that might threaten his waning grip on power. By this point, we know that Lenin is not a moron. He's a very intelligent man. and he would have known that he was public enemy number one. Russia wasn't safe for him again, so this leads him to flee from Finland to Switzerland. While Lenin is in Sweden, he tries to exchange a few more of the robbery banknotes. Bolshevik leadership moves the Bolshevik Center to Paris in December of 1908, despite Lenin's protest. And of course, Lenin protested to it. He protested to pretty much everything. He even has the goal to call Paris, quote, a foul hole. Interesting. Not the typical term we associate with Paris. He also compares it to Russia at the same time, and he even sues a motorist who knocked him off of his bike. So everything is just going great for Lenin at this time. He's trying to exchange dirty money. He's causing problems among the Bolshevik Party. He's getting knocked off of his bike, and now he's suing members of the public. Not the typical persona of a revolutionary. Unsurprisingly, this causes even more conflict between Lenin and the wider Bolshevik Party, especially with a man named Alexander Bogdanov, who was one of the members who voted for the move to Paris. These two go at it. A majority of the conflict between Lenin and Bogdanov comes down to a difference of opinion, which we have seen before with Lenin. And it's also good to see that nothing has changed. Again, Lenin is getting his panties in a bunch over a difference in theology. Lenin criticizes Bogdanov's view that the proletariat working classes needed to develop a socialist culture in order to become a successful revolutionary movement. Lenin sees things a little differently. He believes that the working classes needed to be led by a vanguard or socialist intelligentsia during the revolution. In other words, he and his cronies had to lead the way for the working classes because they were too dumb to do it themselves. And just like Tsar Nicholas, Lenin can't give up any power. In my opinion, these comments show that Lenin isn't too dissimilar from Tsar Nicholas. They both want ultimate power of the party. They want the final say to come through them. Now, why can't the proletariat lead itself? Why does it need Bolshevik guardian angels doing it for them? Because Lenin wants all the power and all the control. Or he simply doesn't trust the people are smart enough to work it out for themselves. Everything has to go through Lenin. Bogdanov's beliefs were a little more flexible than Lenin's. He believed all concepts of the world were relative, while Lenin was a hardline orthodox Marxist, i.e. objective reality was independent of human observation. The pair end up holidaying in Maxim Gorky's vacation house in Capri. When they return, Lenin encouraged Bogdanov and his followers to split, claiming he had departed from strict Marxist ideals. What a cunt. It's now May of 1908. Lenin has a brief stay in London, where he commandeers the writing room of the British Museum to write his next communist masterpiece called Materialism and Imperio-Criticism. Lenin wrote it as a way to get back at his frenemy Bogdanov, calling it, quote, bourgeoisie reactionary falsehood, taking a swipe at his belief in everything was relative. Once again, Lenin was ruffling the feathers within the Bolshevik ranks. So much so, he was alienating more and more Bolshevik members every day, due to his inflexible point of view and hardline attitude towards everything. Even his close friends, such as Lev Kamenev and Alexei Rokov, could no longer see eye to eye with Lenin. But for Tsar Nicholas and his Okhrana, conflict among the Bolsheviks was a good thing. The Tsar capitalizes on this by sending a spy to infiltrate the group, a man named Roman Malinovsky. He was sent to be a fierce supporter of Lenin in the wake of a divided party. Members of the Bolsheviks weren't fooled by Roman, however, expressing their concerns to Lenin. Now, it's not 100% clear if Lenin knew Roman was a spy or not. It's a pretty good chance that he did have his suspicions. Lenin was suspicious of everybody, so why should Roman be an exception? And he seems to lay low too and get out of town when things get too hot, which stands to reason that he knew Roman wasn't legit. He also could have been feeding him bullshit information to see if it made its way back up the ladder to the Tsar. So things go quiet for the next year. In 1910 to 1911, Lenin attends Congress after Congress. The 8th Congress of the Second International was held in Copenhagen. He then went on holiday in Stockholm with his sister and mother. Lenin does love going on holidays for a guy that doesn't really seem to do much besides talk and stir up trouble for a living. So from there he moves to France with his sister and wife, living it up in Bonbon and then Paris. While in France, Lenin becomes friends with Inessa Armand, a French Bolshevik. Were Miss Armand and Lenin just Bolsheviks? Just friends? Or were they more than that? Were they fuck buddies? Some think so, especially between the years 1910 to 1912. There might be something to this, however. Inessa was almost lost to history. She was a French-Russian communist politician, as well as being a feminist in a time when this wasn't really the popular thing to be. She was also a member of the Bolsheviks. She lives in Russia for a majority of her life. Why is she important, you might ask? When Lenin was down on his luck and out of favour with the majority of the Bolshevik Party, she reached into the swampy muck and pulled Lenin out into the sunshine again. She was a key figure in the years before the revolution and in the years after, during the rise of communism. So this brings up the question, how was she nearly forgotten to history? Well, when Stalin comes to power, he brought with him a series of obscene censorship laws, which stayed in place for decades to come. Why does he bring such strict laws in? It kind of goes with the title of leader of the Soviet Union. You can't control the state and the people unless you have some pretty strict laws. But why go to all the trouble of covering up Miss Armand? There are several reasons Stalin might have done this. One might have been her relationship with Lenin. Stalin was the jealous type. Was he jealous of the relationship between these two? Was it a simple covering up of the truth? Was he doing a favour for Lenin's reputation? Or was there more of a sexist angle to it? She was a feminist pioneer at a time that it wasn't really that popular. And ultimately, she is a woman who more or less rescues the Bolshevik Party. Was he trying to cover this fact up? You can't have a woman saving the Bolshevik Party because this just wasn't on. Did this rub Stalin the wrong way? Was this counterintuitive to the Soviet narrative he was trying to push? Was it personal issues with Lenin? I suspect he was trying to cover up the truth of her saving the Bolshevik Party. I don't think he could really handle that. And I think it goes against the established narrative of the Bolshevik Party. Most of Inessa Armand's story comes to light when the Soviet archives were opened in the 1990s. And even then we only know half the story because Russian archives are still locked up tight. Why, you might wonder? I suspect there's a lot of interesting truths that a lot of people don't want coming to light. However, Inessa Armand might not be as virtuous as she seems. Some historians think that she helped Lenin climb back to the top of the Bolshevik leadership, refining his skills, turning the Bolsheviks from a bunch of squabbling windbags into a formidable political party that ultimately becomes more powerful than the Tsar. This works in her favour. By the time 1919 rolls around, Miss Armand was the most powerful woman in Moscow. And this leads me to think that Stalin was a little bit jealous of that. I also think he didn't want the world to know that a woman was behind Lenin's triumphant return, and ultimately the return, the rebooting, and the revitalization of the Bolshevik Party. Maybe the biggest reason for suppressing Inessa Armand's story is simply because it doesn't fit with the Soviet narrative. It doesn't fit with the Soviet version of history. Otherwise, why go to all the effort to bury her story in the Soviet archives if it didn't represent some type of threat? That's the interesting thing about the Soviet archives, is they suppressed a lot of information, but they kept pretty much everything. They just didn't release it to the public. Why not erase her from the history books altogether and destroy her records? But then again, if you did it for her, you'd have to do it for everyone that's been a counterpoint to the communist Soviet narrative, which would be a lot of fucking people, and the archives would be pretty small. So on the one hand, they kind of want to preserve history, but they don't want to release it, which is an interesting paradox. It's now June 1911, and during the RSDLP Central Committee meeting held in Paris of that year, a decision was made by the Bolsheviks that enough was enough. No more setting up shops overseas and no more running away from the Tsar. The RSLDP decides to move their operations back to Russia, closing Bolshevik newspapers and centres in Paris. Lenin has been waiting for an opportunity to work his way up the Bolshevik ladder again and gain back some of his influence and credibility. So is this the chance he's been waiting for? However, like we've seen a few times already in this tale, things would not be easy for Lenin. He organises a party conference the following year in January of 1912 in Prague. 18 members went to the conference, with 16 of the members being Bolshevik. During the meeting, Lenin was critiqued by other members for spreading factionalism within Bolshevik ranks. His hardline attitude comes back to bite him, and it doesn't really pay to be a prick all the time. Maybe if he was a bit more accepting of outside ideas, he wouldn't have found himself in this position. And this ultimately prevents him from regaining his position. And I'm kind of amazed it took this long for people to see him as a radical and potentially a very dangerous leader. So what does Lenin do? Well, he does what he did best: run away to another country in search of salvation. He travels to Kharkov in the Kingdom of Galicia and Ludomeria. While there, he commandeers Jagiellonian University's library, where he conducts research. Now, at this point, it kind of sounds like some of my old uni teachers, too scared to take a chance in the real world. All they do is study or get a job at the university teaching some bullshit course no one takes seriously. Now, Lenin doesn't seem to have learnt much from his past mistakes and goes back to being the same old Lenin we all know and love. He starts talking a tough game, but doesn't really want to get his hands dirty when it comes time. And even though he is constantly whining about change and the need for violent revolution that would cost millions of lives to bring about this quote-unquote great change, when it comes down to it, he runs back to the safe and secure embrace of the library and the comfort of research. It's a way of still being at the forefront of this great socialist change, but it doesn't require doing anything that would be hardcore or put himself in harm's way. That's one of my biggest issues with Lenin. He's never there when the changes are going on. You'd think he'd want to have a front row seat during these revolutions and any type of change in society, given the amount of time and effort he's already put into the party and trying to get the great social change off the ground. While Lenin is researching at the library, he remains in contact with the RSLDP and the Bolsheviks who were in the Tsar's Duma. He managed to convince them to break their parliamentary allegiances with the Mensheviks. This is an underestimated aspect of Lenin. His influence is still very strong, despite everything that's happened. He's very influential, and he is clearly making some very big power moves and setting things in motion for the future. He lays low for the rest of the year and stays in the library and researches, biding his time. It's now January of 1913, and Lenin's old friend and accomplice, Stalin, pays him a visit to discuss the future of non-Russian ethnic groups in the empire. And alarm bells and red flags should have been sounding and flying very high. This is Stalin giving a little preview of what's to come and a pretty clear indicator that something isn't right with this guy, and maybe this future plan may have some extreme or sinister intent behind it. Lenin calls Joseph Stalin, quote, the wonderful Georgian. And after all, Stalin wasn't Russian. Is Stalin deflecting or overcompensating for this fact and trying to draw attention away from his ethnicity by going all in on future plans which would ultimately end in genocide? From there, Lenin and his wife moved to Bern. She had to go there for surgery. Neither Lenin or his wife were in the best physical shape, and both had a series of ailing health issues. As the year came to a close, it became more and more evident that the prospects of war were becoming greater and greater. World War I was on the horizon and would ultimately set the stage for the coming revolution. It is 1914. and war breaks out all over Europe. And it's not long before it catches up to Russia and to Lenin and Tsar Nicholas. As I mentioned before, Lenin was a very smart man. He was also a very cunning one and knew how to turn any situation to his own advantage. And it wasn't long before Lenin was looking for ways he could turn this upcoming war to his own advantage. Lenin was in Eastern Europe in Galicia, modern-day southern Poland and Ukraine. Galicia was a heavily fought-over region during World War I. It had started off being aligned with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then the Russian Empire, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then the Russian Empire again. And at the start of World War I, Lenin found himself in trouble with the law, again, but this time it wasn't for the reasons you might think. He was arrested because he was Russian due to the fact that Russia was now at war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he had a Russian passport. He was released not long afterwards. He explained why he was in Galicia and his anti-Tsar sentiments. Lenin leaves Galicia, briefly stopping over in Bern before travelling on to Zurich in February of 1916. As usual, he was pissed off at someone or something. This time around, it was the German Social Democratic Party for their supporting Germany in the war. Lenin was pissed because this was a violation of the treaty agreed upon during the Second International's Stuttgart Resolution. This was more or less an agreement by the socialist parties that would oppose the war. They saw it as a capitalist war that would cost millions of lives. In an ironic sense of duality, the same thing more or less happens during the communist era. Even though they were on opposite ends of the spectrum, the capitalists and the communists were more or less the same. Both of their wars end up costing millions of lives. In regards to Bogdanov's philosophy, it's all relative. Among Lenin's traits, he was also a warmonger and had no problem spurring on conflict whenever someone didn't agree with him. For the next 2 years, Lenin travels around attending conferences while the rest of the world was at war. He attends the Zimmerwald Conference in September of 1915 and the Kingthal Conference in April 1916. While at the conferences, he does what he does best. He tries to start shit. He tries to convince socialists all across Europe to transform the quote-unquote imperialist war into an all-out war right across the continent, which he called the quote-unquote civil war where the proletariat take up arms against the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy that ruled over them. In my opinion, this is total fucking insanity, and I don't understand how he wasn't taken out by his own party members for being a lunatic extremist. A world war was already waging, and he thinks it's a good idea to start a continent-wide war. Why wouldn't he? Lenin's not exactly going to be a frontline soldier. He's not in danger of losing his life for someone else's beliefs. He's just spurring on a bunch of pro-war rhetoric. He's completely devoid from the realism and horror of war, and it should have been pretty evident. World War I had already started at this point. There was enough evidence that war was hell, and he wants an even bigger conflict on a continent-wide scale. Lenin doesn't have the balls to go through with many of his over-the-top threats and completely bombastic statements. And fortunately, by this time, his powers of persuasion were starting to fade. And once again, the winds of destiny came blowing Lenin's way. 2 months later, in July, his mother died. And just like the passing of his father and brother, this had a profound effect on him. It was made all the more painful due to Lenin not being able to attend his mother's funeral. This causes Lenin to fall into a deep cycle of depression. It affects his thoughts and his writing. He even begins to ponder his own death, and he starts to fear that he will not see this great proletarian revolution come to fruition. There is a lot going on upstairs for Lenin, and just like his brother and father's passing, his thoughts and mood are deeply affected by it. And due to this deep depressive cycle Lenin finds himself in, he lays low for the rest of the year and most of the following, re-emerging in September of 1917 with a brand new written work called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin pretty much says that imperialism is a product of monopoly capitalism. You might be asking, what is monopoly capitalism? Well, I'm going to tell you. According to Lenin, the capitalists in society seek to maximize their profits by venturing into new territories, more or less the same way as every big company has moved their operations overseas because labor is cheaper and the cost of raw materials is lower. Can't say I disagree. It's one of the few things I do agree with him on. This is a very big issue in today's world, where a lot of Western companies have moved their operations offshore because labor and materials are cheaper, but the product and quality are inferior, yet the price is more expensive than what it was 20 or 30 years ago. Look at your favorite brands: Ford, GM, Adidas, Under Armour, Apple, Levi's, Nike. They all make their products overseas because they are cheaper. And how many companies in the Western world have packed up domestic operations and moved them overseas because they save a few bucks on the cost of a t-shirt? In some cases, the difference in price is only 30 cents or so, but I guess it's a big enough difference and justification to move overseas. I suppose if you're making 1 million white t-shirts and they cost 55 cents each to make in the US, and you can make them for 30 cents in Bangladesh, yes, that does save money, but at what cost? The cost of the domestic worker, the domestic consumer. Someone's saving money and it's going in straight into someone else's pockets. So production costs might be cheaper, but that doesn't mean the overall money saved is really going to affect the company that much. It could end up in some CEO's pocket or go to some other area or something like that. I'm probably starting to sound like a communist now. Lenin believed this expanding into new frontiers to exploit the worker would lead to conflict, ending in war once again, and that this war would go on until the proletariat revolution overthrew and cast out the capitalist scumdogs, more or less. And after the capitalists were gone, socialism would be installed and everything would be fine, and everyone would get along and enjoy getting paid the same for doing different jobs that require vastly different levels of education, competency, and skill levels. And who's to say that another more aggressive and oppressive system wouldn't sneak in under the radar and destroy Lenin's delusional dream? And I think this is pretty much what this is. It's a delusional theory. How does he expect the economy to grow? How do you prosper if you're not getting investment? Even if it is foreign investment, he's always been at odds with people who have suggested foreign investment. And after all, isn't that modern business? It's not located in a specific country anymore. Like I mentioned about those mega brands, they're global brands. They're not American or Japanese brands. They are global brands now. Communism and capitalism don't work, but capitalism is the much better choice. Yes, it does need some alterations to be probably fairer and to limit greed and the complete destruction of everything in the name of profit. But it's definitely better than the alternative. The other issue I have with Lenin is none of these theories he comes up with, or these hypothetical scenarios for the perfect society, are tested. They're all just theories that really aren't based on much. He hasn't even tried them on a micro level. He goes away for a year, does a bunch of research, comes up with this new insane theory that is unproven, untried and tested, and just expects it's going to take hold, and he can pretty much vomit this ideology onto a society and everything's going to work out the way he has envisioned it in his very interesting and twisted mind. In the years prior to the release of Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin spent a lot of time reading and comparing the works that influenced his idols, such as Aristotle, Georg Wilhelm, Friedrich Hegel, and Ludwig Feuerbach. It's at this time his thoughts, theories, and interpretation of Marxism begin to change. Lenin changes his opinion when once he believed that his theories and policies could be proven by predetermined scientific principles. He now believed that the only way to truly test a policy was by putting it into practice. He was still an orthodox Marxist at heart. The only difference now is that his thinking was branching off from that of Karl Marx. Marxism, on one hand, theorized that, quote-unquote, bourgeoisie democratic revolution of middle classes had to happen first before a socialist proletariat one could. Lenin, on the other hand, now thought along opposite lines, believing instead to take up arms against the government. He believed that the proletariat could overthrow the Tsar without the need for a prior revolution that set the stage for the workers to rise up against their oppressor. I'm going to read a quote about World War I, written by Lenin, that illustrates his new line of thought. The First World War is being waged for the division of the colonies and the robbery of foreign territory. Thieves have fallen out, and to refer to the defeats at any given moment of one of the thieves in order to identify the interests of all thieves with the interests of the nation or the fatherland is an unconscionable bourgeoisie lie. That is by Lenin on his interpretation of the First World War. So is Lenin a total fucking lunatic, or is he a genius, or somewhere in between? He's been so all over the place. His obsession with war and conflict are highly disturbing. I'm not sure he has really accounted for the cost of war and what that would look like. His obsession to bring down the Tsar may have clouded his judgment. I'm not sure he understands the full cost of war, especially a continent-wide revolutionary war. This is at a time when World War I was raging and the brutal reality of war could be seen. To have such direct access to the realities of war and to still pioneer war and conflict is highly disturbing. And I think shows that Lenin may have been on the insane side a little more than he was on the genius side. That's just my opinion. What do you think is going on with Lenin upstairs? Is he a genius? Is he a lunatic? Is he walking a fine line between the two? World War I is raging. The stage is being set for the revolution. It also gives Lenin the perfect opportunity to strike the heart of his greatest enemy, Tsar Nicholas, and to pave the way for his glorious communist revolution that would fundamentally change Russian society forever. And that concludes the Lie of Communism, Chapter 2. The next installment, Chapter 3, will pick up where we left off, looking at World War I and its consequences for Russia, and Tsar Nicholas, as well as the whereabouts of Lenin and Trotsky during the revolution, and much, much more. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be another jam-packed episode, and it's going to be well worth the wait. And that brings us to the end of the show. A big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. The Lie of Communism has been a labour of love over the past 3 and a bit years. I really appreciate everybody listening to the end. I hope you all learnt something from it. Chapter 3 is going to be another jam-packed episode full of action, drama, intrigue, outrage, revolution, and everything else in between. So definitely look out for that. The next episode might be a weekly tank episode or a smaller historical show. Could be a film review, might be a current event. Who knows? Alright, big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. If you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. You can download and listen to your favourite episodes of the Truth Tank on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, Pandora, Castbox, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show, help spread the word and get it out there. If you feel so inclined, why not leave a 5-star rating and review on your preferred podcast player or all of them? It'd be greatly appreciated by me and helps the Truth Tank get found and rise through the ranks. The Truth Tank store may or may not be operational by the time you hear this. It's still a work in progress. I've been saying that a lot lately. It's still a work in progress, unfortunately. But it will be coming at some point this year. You'll be able to get yourself some wearable truth, including some limited edition Lie of Communism merch. So definitely look out for that one. And I will be back in the next week or two with a weekly tank episode, a smaller show. Chapter 3 of the Lie of Communism shouldn't be too far away. I'm aiming to get one done a month. But until then, I'm a tank. This is the truth. The lie has begun, but the truth will be told.